I was never the kind of man to snoop through other people's belongings, but the moment I stepped into my brother's house, I felt something gnawing at me. A deep, unsettling feeling. A whisper of suspicion I couldn't quite put into words. Robert had invited me over for drinks. He seemed relaxed, smiling, chatting about trivial things. But I could feel my insides twisting into knots. It had been 3 years since my daughter Emma had gone missing. A week later, they found her body in the woods. Or what was left of it. The police never found her killer. I lived with that weight every single day until I walked into Robert's living room and saw a dark red notebook lying on his coffee table. I picked it up. I opened it. And my world collapsed. She cried at first, but then she stopped. Then she just lay there, and after that, nothing. You should have seen her eyes, brother. There was something otherworldly in them. I wonder what it feels like to die when you're only 9. I kept reading, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the damn thing. My ears were ringing. My breathing was uneven. I wanted to tear that notebook apart, to grab Robert by the throat and smash his skull into the floor until he was nothing but a red mess on the carpet. But instead, I exhaled. I closed the notebook, and I smiled. "Hey, Rob," I said smoothly, setting the notebook back down. "Let's have a drink." I took a sip of whiskey, watching as Robert did the same. He kept talking something about work, something about a woman he was seeing, but I wasn't listening. I just watched. I waited. And soon, his words slurred. His eyelids grew heavy, and then his head dropped onto the table. I let myself have 1 minute, just one, to sit there and watch him, unconscious and completely unaware of what was about to happen. Then I stood up, grabbed him by the arms, and dragged him downstairs into the basement. I had prepared everything. When Robert woke up, he knew something was wrong. For one, it was dark. For another, it was cold. And most importantly, he couldn't move. His breathing quickened. "What?" His voice was hoarse. "Charlie?" I flicked on the overhead light. Robert's pupils shrank as he took in his surroundings. He was strapped to a surgical table, his wrists, ankles, and chest secured tightly with thick leather restraints. The dim light above him flickered against the gleaming instruments laid out on a metal tray. Clamps, scalpels, forceps, a bone saw. On the table beside them, syringes filled with dark liquid. "Charlie," his voice wavered. "What is this? What the fuck is this?" I stepped closer, my shadow stretching across his trembling form. "You always did have a way with words, Rob," I said, my voice calm, steady. "You described everything so beautifully in that little notebook of yours. Every last detail of my daughter's murder." Robert's eyes widened, his entire body stiffened. "You read?" I nodded. "And now," I said, picking up a syringe, "it's your turn." The first injection went straight into his chest. Adrenaline. His back arched, his breath caught in his throat, and his pupils dilated instantly. You're insane," he wheezed, thrashing against the restraints. "Let me go, Charlie. This isn't you." I tilted my head, studying him. "Not me?" I chuckled softly. "Then who the fuck am I, Rob?" I reached for a long, thin metal probe and ran it gently under his fingernail. "Do you remember how she screamed?" I asked, pushing the metal deeper. Robert's jaw clenched, his eyes filled with tears. "Please," he choked out. "Please, Charlie. I was drunk. 2 didn't mean." I twisted the probe. His screams filled the basement. I worked slowly, methodically, A heated scalpel traced lines over his flesh, leaving thin trails of red in its wake. Ice pressed to raw wounds, sending spasms through his limbs. A clamp around his pinky finger, just tight enough to crush bone. And every time his screams grew weak, every time his head began to lull to the side, I injected another dose of adrenaline into his veins. He had to feel everything. Part 4, The Confession. 2 hours in, he broke. Tears mixed with sweat and blood as he sobbed uncontrollably. "I killed her. I killed Emma," he wailed, his body convulsing. "Oh God, Charlie. 2 didn't mean Topley's." "I picked up a hammer." "What did you say?" His breath hitched. I was drunk," he whispered. "I don't even remember. I clenched the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white." "So it was an accident, huh?" I slammed the hammer down on his hand. The snap of bones echoed through the basement. Robert's scream was almost inhuman. "Repeat that," I said, stepping closer, my breath hot against his face. "Tell me it was an accident again." He shook violently, eyes darting wildly. He swallowed thickly, his lips trembling. I liked it. I stared at him, and then, ever so slowly, I smiled. That's all I needed to hear. I left him there. For 3 days. By the time I returned, he was barely conscious, lips cracked, his body shivering. "Charlie," he whispered, voice barely audible. I sat down across from him, exhaling slowly. "Emma was a kind girl," I murmured. "She believed that everyone deserved a second chance." His eyes lit up with desperate hope. Yes, Charlie She would have forgiven me, she. I reached for my gun. "Hi," I said, cocking the hammer. "Don't." The gunshot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. His head snapped back, blood splattered across the wall. I sat there for a moment, staring at his lifeless body. Then slowly, I stood up. I picked up the notebook, and I set it on fire. The police called it a tragic accident. I returned home that night. I sat on Emma's bed, and for the first time in 3 years, I closed my eyes and felt at peace.